We've all seen the pictures. The same 5 pictures that keep showing us that they can pass off as white Caucasians, thus proving that no Egyptian was ever black. These videos usually have names like The Real Faces of Egypt and feature Greek statues operating as stand-ins for traditional Egyptian art. Faded statues might be shown, and sometimes the work does appear to be of a person who doesn't appear to be a so-called black African. But appearances can be deceiving. These Eurocentrics compile slideshows, websites, and books that feature hand-selected photos intended to imply white Caucasian innuendos. Flesh-colored people on a tomb wall in strange poses could be passed off as everyday Egyptians, or an ambiguous sarcophagus with idolized features will adorn the cover of a book. An idolized statue of a goddess might be featured in a close-up on the History Channel, while one with more natural features will be explained away in amateur circles as a white or Arab-type woman with high cheekbones and full lips. We've seen this scribe so many times, he might as well live at our house. But the guy on the right never gets any airtime, thanks to Amateur Hour. In fact, there are many Egyptian artifacts that are never compiled on Eurocentric videos because their stance is no Egyptian was ever black African, and if so, it was a foreigner. Unfortunately for the Euro critics, this is a wacky theory, and it keeps hanging on a string of hope that's about to drop them into a bottomless pit. Their racist envy and greed for treasure leaves them open to moments of cognitive dissonance. When they see the fine craftsmanship of this statue, they tell themselves that this is a Caucasian in an Afro wig, whose ancestors also used Afro picks even in the pre-dynastic period. This is what we're dealing with, folks. So let's leave the land of fantasies and get black to reality, where we see 2 types of people that made up the population of ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians are usually depicted in mainstream academia, cable documentaries, and racist YouTube videos as some sort of mysterious race that was related to no one, or some mysterious non-black people migrated there and taught them the mysteries of the universe. But enough of that. There is no evidence for mass migration, and the people who became the main stock of Egyptians descended from people that had already been in Africa for 100,000 plus years. This isn't a documentary on the pre-dynastic period, it's one on presentation. The ancient Egyptians knew exactly what the people around them looked like, and they certainly weren't confused. An Egyptian knew the difference between himself and a so-called Caucasian person, both culturally and physically. An Egyptian knew the difference between himself and a so-called Caucasian person, both culturally and physically. There wasn't much ambiguity there, despite the fact that many academics wish to keep things ambiguous. But what about the kings? Egypt ruled as the only united kingdom on the face of this earth for about 800 years when we saw the rise of Sargon. For the most part, most of these kings were depicted pretty dark, and their faces, even when stylized, had heavy African features. Instead, what you'll see is works with generalized or symbolic features on Google search and in your favorite library and picture books. That's because this guy is simply too much for them. His lips are not thin enough, his nose was too big, and he looks too much like a black guy. But this is still an Egyptian king, and that king had himself depicted in this way for posterity. Now this brings us to a side note. Even the most Afrocentric people get this idea in their head that a black Egyptian looked like some type of African-Arab mix. But this is a wives' tale that has succeeded through lazy research. There are way too many Egyptian artworks that can pass for your average African person. That's because the average Egyptian was an African person that just happened to live in Egypt. So it's clear here that it wasn't necessary to look like a Habesha Ethiopian in order to live in ancient Egypt. But what about Egyptians like these? The Eurocritics love to spam these photos down the throats of their Afrocentric enemies, as if these mean something. These are the other people in Egypt that I talked about. It's obvious that these people may not actually be black, but are still Egyptians culturally. What the Euro critics need to understand is these lighter-skinned, hook-nosed people living in Egypt that are featured in elite scenes are simply one type of Egyptian. The other type is a black African type that we can call your stock Egyptian, because Upper Egypt has had no population replacement by outsiders in its ancient history. These black Egyptians were much more common in the artwork, and if you look at enough of it, you start to notice that the average Egyptian, in mundane scenes to the most high-powered scenes, are usually depicted as pretty dark and look exactly like Africans would look anywhere. If you were to turn to the History Channel or most random books on Egypt, most of the time you'll be exposed to a carefully crafted image that implies only one type of Caucasian person. It's academically irresponsible that these entities outright ignore the mountain of tomb walls featuring a decidedly different looking Egypt than what has been presented. Here we see many types of Egyptian men, from priests to elite gentlemen, but you'll rarely see a collage like this in a HarperCollins picture book on Egyptian art. It's the same with these wooden models. Many of them appear to be straight up black guys with afros. These were the rowers of the boats in Kemet. All those stories you hear about the Egyptians allegedly sailing around the world spreading knowledge, well, here's your sailors, folks. So far, we've seen that the average Egyptian citizen was depicted as brown to very dark brown. There's an amateur debate in the air about Egyptian skin color being featured as light, and Nubians being the only dark-colored people in the Egyptian universe. This childish tale is still being told, despite the fact that anyone can go to Egypt, review the walls, and see that many Egyptians were depicted just as dark as any Nubian. Nubians and also Egyptians have regularly been depicted in some sort of brown to dark brown to black color. There wasn't just any one shade either. So anyone hanging on to this fantasy might want to get a grip. As for this alleged debate about skin tans, the people there today aren't burning, so it's not even worth discussing. I think I'll leave that to a super Egyptian in Stormfront. Anyway, getting back to our point, the people of ancient Egypt were a black people, but they had a people living amongst them as Egyptians who technically may not have originated in Africa as a people, but after living together for a few thousand years, they were just plain old Egyptians. We need to remember that the pre-dynastic Roman period has no evidence of population displacement of the original Egyptians. They simply absorbed these populations as they did with the... Let's talk about Egyptian women and women's obsession with being ancient Egyptian women. In fact, I usually find the biggest Egyptian groupies to be white American women for some reason. The problem is your average white girl wasn't usually featured on the walls of Kemet. Now we do have stuff like this, but at the end of the day, it's decidedly rare, even by Eurocentric YouTube standards. You see, the average Egyptian woman wasn't a white woman and wasn't depicted that way either. To get around this, the Euro critics will add a placeholder like a symbolic yellow-colored woman and pass that off as a stock Egyptian type. But, as usual, they never show the pictures the people deserve to see. As you can see, none of them looks like this white chick dressed as a freak. And of course the Eurocentrics know how to paint up their own image library, and they insert that into their websites and videos instead of just using the thousands of years of real Egyptian women. We need to remember that the experts on Proto-Indo-Europeans never included a trip to Egypt in the wanderings of prehistoric white people. So when it comes to the mysteries of Egypt, damn it, there were plenty of white girls there, right? Well, actually not really. You see, even though we have this lady here, most of the time, these females marked as so-called non-black women are usually engaged in some sort of subordinate behavior, usually directed at an Egyptian official decidedly darker than them. Now, if we used Eurocentric standards of Egyptian art, then we see Caucasian women kneeling, doing manual labor, doing hair, providing entertainment, and mostly all around not being worshipped in Egyptian fashion. Most of what we see appears to be, frankly, services to black people and providing entertainment. So, to many Euro critics, this is sad news and it bothers them, but we can't change history. So if you're a white woman and you're obsessed with being a fantasy Egyptian woman, I suggest you talk to the local ladies of Upper Egypt or any of the nice women on the Nile and the Sudan. And of course our Ethiopian sisters are decidedly gorgeous, and many of them look exactly like Egyptian women in the flesh. Speaking of Egyptian women, the New Kingdom was a period in Egypt where the culture was rich and the people were in their prime. I looked at women like the real Nefertiti or any of Akhenaten's daughters, and I think about how black these people looked at such an incredible time in Egyptian history. These incredible works stand as a testimony to the ancient magnificence and mystery of the black woman. As we noted at the beginning of this program, the ancient Egyptian people knew exactly how the people around them looked, and they knew how they themselves looked in comparison. Having said that, the Egyptians regularly depicted these foreign elements which have been identified. Here we see that these individuals coming into the country from West Asia didn't look anything like your average stock Egyptian. The Euro critics love to wax eloquently on Nubian punishments, but we never hear a peep about the mountain of depictions of obvious Caucasians being tied up, tortured, or just looking plain embarrassed. When we couple this with the fact that Egypt was an amazing African empire, you can see how we could care less what your average Arab or European thinks of African people. To sum all of this up, the fact remains that when it comes to the average Egyptian citizen, they came in two varieties and everything else was simply a variation in between these two types. Since no population replacement happened in ancient times, and places like Heracleopolis have undisturbed archaeological layers demonstrating this, it makes sense that most of the people there would have been native Africans. This is why the heart of Egypt was always in the south, and its greatest kings like Narmer, Mentuhotep II, and Amenhotep III all came out of the south and frankly looked exactly like black people. This was your ruling class of the world's greatest civilization. If anyone that was not black was in that ruling class, it's because the native elite knew these people and let them in. This amazing civilization was the culmination of thousands of years of African history, not the beginning of it. It is the beginning for Europeans because their history is so young. But when we look at things from an African perspective, the way it should be, we end up having a better understanding of the magnificence and antiquity of the African mind. You can have your Greeces, your Romes, and your Mesopotamians. We'll take Egypt. Thanks for watching.